Welcome to today's live session here on the Case X, True Crime Psychology channel. This is the space where we look back at the cases that once shook public opinion and explore what truly drives a person to the edge of committing a crime. I'd also like to share that starting today, and explore the channel will have regular live sessions every Sunday at noon. If you're interested in criminal psychology analysis and want to join the discussion, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out. There are cases when you read them again feel like a movie script, full of twists, holds, and so unbelievable that you have to wonder if they actually happened. Feel like 5 women, each with a different story. 5 paths that led to crime. Every one of them was once a child who might have longed to be loved, to be protected, or at least to be seen as a normal human being. But somehow their lives slid into darkness. And one day, they crossed a line that very few people ever dare to step over. Tonight, we'll open the files of cases that have haunted the public for decades, to look deeper into the questions. Why did they do it? Were they born different, or did this world itself shape them into what they became? Among all the killers whose names have been recorded in criminal history, female offenders remain a much bigger mystery than we often imagine. Because society has always been used to seeing women as gentle, patient, even willing to sacrifice everything for their families. When they become the perpetrators, people feel not only fear, but also a sense of betrayal. These stories may be ones you've heard somewhere before, but I believe that when we look at them through a psychological lens, we'll discover much more to reflect on. And before we begin, I want you to ask yourself one small question, a question that will echo throughout this entire analysis. If you had to choose, do you believe the root of crime lies within each person's mind or in the circumstances that push them onto this painful path? Keep that question in mind. And now, let's begin. In every town, there's someone people trust without question. They bring food to the grieving. They sit by sick beds through the night. They show up over and over when no one else does. Gesche Gottfried was that person in Bremen, a woman of quiet grace and boundless compassion who had lost so many, a husband, children, parents, even close friends. And yet, instead of turning bitter, she turned outward. She gave more, smiled more, helped more. The city called her the Angel of Bremen. To them, she was the very image of goodness, soft-spoken, gentle, and endlessly giving. But behind every act of kindness, something darker was at work. The grief, the mourning, the trail of funerals, none of it was accidental. The hands that comforted were the same hands that stirred arsenic into soup. And the tears she cried weren't for the dead. They were for the performance. For years, she walked freely among them, praised for her strength and grace, even as those closest to her fell sick in her presence, even as their deaths piled up with eerie consistency. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't about money. This was something colder, more deliberate, the kind of case that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truths that live inside the minds we least suspect. What makes a woman do this? What turns nurture into a weapon? This is more than a story of murder. It's a study in control, deception, and the human instinct to believe what we want to see. It's a window into criminal psychology, cloaked in lace and sympathy, and it stands among the most haunting in the world of true crime documentary. This is the case of Gesche Gottfried, and it will stay with you long after the credits roll. At the turn of the 19th century, Bremen was a proud city. Perched on the banks of the Weser River, it was a hub for trade and craftsmanship, a place where cobbled streets echoed with the footsteps of merchants, tailors, and housewives alike. It was a city shaped by tradition, by family name, by the rhythms of church bells and daily labor. And in that world, a woman's role was quiet, domestic, predictable. She married young, bore children, and carried the burdens of her family behind closed doors. A woman who smiled through hardship was praised. A woman who served without complaint was sainted. Gesche Margaret Tim was born into that order in 1785. Her father was a tailor, her mother a seamstress. They didn't have wealth, but they had structure, rules to live by, roles to follow. And for a while, Gesche followed them. She was polite, well-liked, intelligent. People noticed her beauty, yes, but also her calm demeanor. She seemed steady, capable, everything a man might want in a wife, and everything a city expected in a woman. When she married young, no one questioned it. When she bore 3 children, no one blinked. And when her husband died suddenly, people whispered only sympathy. After all, illness was everywhere. Typhoid, cholera, diphtheria. You could go to sleep with a cough and not wake up. No one was shocked when death came, not at first. But what this true crime documentary reveals, what makes this case so disturbing, is not just how Gesche killed. It's how long no one noticed. Not because she was invisible, but because she fit so perfectly into the picture of what a good woman looked like. This isn't just a murder story. It's a study in how societal roles can become camouflage, how the expectations we place on women can sometimes become the very thing that hides the danger. And in Gesche's case, it hid a darkness that would take over a decade to name. Or a time she was just another widow, grieving, struggling, trying to move on. When her husband died in 1813, Gesche mourned like any other woman would. She wore black. She kept her head down. She was left alone to raise 3 children in a world that offered women little protection. In those days, a widow had few choices. There were no social services, no safety nets. You either remarried quickly or you relied on the kindness of your family, if you were lucky enough to still have one. Gesche had pride. She didn't beg. She didn't crumble. She nursed her children, took in sick relatives, kept the household running, even as grief layered itself over her like thick wool. When her mother fell ill the following year, Gesche stayed by her side every night. Neighbors said they heard singing from the window, soft lullabies, half prayers. She cooked, cleaned, prayed. And when her mother died, they said Gesche had the look of someone broken, but dignified. Then came the children. One by one, her daughters grew pale, then weak. Doctors came and went, unable to do much. And when her son, the last of them, cried out in the middle of the night and never woke again, the city grieved with her. No one questioned why she still lit candles in the window. No one asked why she kept baking, kept smiling softly when she walked past. Because in their eyes, Gesche wasn't cursed. She was surviving. To the people of Bremen, she had already suffered more than most could bear. She was the neighbor who never turned away a beggar, the friend who showed up at your doorstep with broth and blankets when your child caught fever. She didn't collapse. She carried everyone. And when she began caring for her aging father, no one blinked. Of course she would. She had already proven her strength. But strength, true strength, is complicated. And in the world of criminal psychology, it often wears disguises. Some people become hard when life breaks them. Some become bitter, cold, violent. But others become something harder to detect. They become pleasers. They wear sorrow like a badge of honor. They give, until giving itself becomes the mask that hides a need for control, until martyrdom becomes a strategy. And Gesche had learned something powerful. People don't fear the woman who cries. They fear the woman who smiles and survives. By the time Gesche buried her father, most in Bremen believed she had suffered more than any one person should. 2 husbands, 3 children, both parents, all lost within the span of just a few years. And yet she remained graceful, composed, always present for others in their times of need. People spoke of her with reverence, as if her sorrow had refined her. They called her resilient. They called her generous. And they believed deeply that some people were simply marked by tragedy. So when her neighbor, Paul Zimmerman, asked for her hand in marriage, the city smiled. Perhaps, they thought, she would finally be happy again. But before they could marry, Paul became ill. He was a strong man, not particularly old, and hadn't been sick a day in his life. Yet his decline came swiftly, piercing stomach pain, weakness, and a sudden spiral toward death. Once again, Gesche was at the bedside, tending to every need, spooning soup between his lips, praying softly while he slept. When he died, people grieved with her. They'd grown used to grieving with her. But for the first time, something in the air shifted. It wasn't outrage or even suspicion, just a faint, uneasy pause. Because Paul wasn't the first, and over the months that followed, he wouldn't be the last. A close friend took ill next, followed by a neighbor who had shared meals with Gesche almost daily. Later, her former music teacher, an older woman known for her robust health, was found dead after weeks of unexplained stomach pain. Each time, the pattern repeated. The sickness came suddenly, the symptoms eerily similar, and always Gesche was there, offering tea, offering comfort, offering presence. 1 or 2 deaths can be explained. Illness is common, especially in crowded cities, but when death becomes routine and it follows the same person from house to house, people begin to wonder. They didn't say it aloud, not yet, but the unease had started to grow, whispers beneath sympathy, questions buried under etiquette. In many true crime cases, the red flags are bold: a bloody shirt, a stolen checkbook, a shattered relationship. But in this one, the signs were subtle, more shadow than shape. There was no violence, no motive that anyone could name, only a widening circle of death, and a woman who seemed strangely untouched by all of it. To the average person, it still looked like bad luck. To someone trained in criminal psychology, it looked like something else entirely: control. Because real power doesn't always scream, it often whispers. And with Gesche, it whispered through funerals, casseroles, and carefully folded linens. But Bremen hadn't heard it yet. Not until one man lived long enough to listen. For years, the people of Bremen had grown accustomed to Gesche's quiet presence. A woman marked by tragedy, moving through grief with the kind of poise that made sorrow look almost graceful. They'd seen her walk behind more than one coffin, head bowed, face composed, as if mourning had become something she knew how to carry. No one questioned it. No one doubted her. That changed when Paul Zimmerman died. He wasn't elderly. He had no chronic illness. He was healthy, respected, well known in the neighborhood, until the day he collapsed with searing abdominal pain and slipped into a spiral that ended in silence. And through all of it, Gesche was there. She had brought him soup, sat beside his bed, whispered prayers as he faded. His death shook the neighborhood, but this time, the grief felt different. It was tangled with something else: confusion, unease, a flicker of doubt that hadn't been there before. Weeks later, a neighbor who regularly shared meals with Gesche fell ill. Then a close friend she had recently visited. Then an elderly music teacher, known for her sharp mind and solid health, who passed after a long stretch of unexplained stomach pain. The details began to echo each other: rapid decline, nearly identical symptoms, and in every case, Gesche close at hand, not as a suspect, but as a friend, a caregiver, a woman known for showing up with warm food and a cool cloth pressed to a fevered brow. At first, people told themselves it made sense. Illness was common in a crowded city like Bremen. Food spoiled easily. Sanitation was poor. Outbreaks happened all the time. But as the deaths began to form a pattern, as the faces lost became more familiar, and as Gesche's name seemed to hover quietly around each tragedy, coincidence no longer felt like a satisfying answer. No one said it aloud, but the silences grew longer. Glances lingered when she entered the room. Hands gripped teacups just a little tighter, and some neighbors began turning away food left kindly at their doorstep. Admiration gave way to caution, not because of hard proof, but because of something quieter: instinct. In most true crime cases, the warning signs are loud: blood on a blade, a missing weapon, a public outburst. But here there was no clear motive, no violence, no shouting, just a trail of quiet deaths, and one woman who stood at the center of it all, still, composed, untouched. And that, more than anything, was what started to frighten them. Johann and Wilhelmina Rumpel didn't know what they were inviting in when they let Gesche into their home. They'd bought her house when she could no longer keep it, and out of kindness, or perhaps admiration, they offered her something few widows received: security. They asked her to stay on as housekeeper, to live with them, to help manage the staff and daily life. To the Rumpels, it felt like hiring a beloved aunt or trusted godmother. But soon after, Wilhelmina became ill. Her decline mirrored so many others: stomach cramps, fatigue, and worsening pain. Again, Gesche was by the bedside. Again, she was praised for her compassion. And again, the patient died. Before she passed, Wilhelmina told her husband she was comforted knowing Gesche would be there to help him through the grief. And so she was. In the months that followed, Gesche took charge of the household. She cooked the meals, oversaw the nurse and the gardener, and when both the maid and the nurse fell sick shortly after, they chalked it up to coincidence. But only at first. The nurse, once recovered, was the first to speak what others hadn't dared to. She told Johann something was wrong. Too many people grew ill around the housekeeper. She said she didn't feel safe, and she refused to stay. At first, Johann dismissed it. He remembered his wife's faith in Gesche. He saw the woman everyone in Bremen still adored. She had nursed his dying wife. She had kept the household running. She had done nothing visibly, tangibly wrong. But doubt is like a splinter. It may be small, but it burrows deep. When Johann himself began to suffer sharp stomach pains not long after, something shifted. This time, he didn't just endure it. He started to watch. He noticed the way Gesche insisted on preparing his meals personally, the way she hovered when he ate, the way she brushed crumbs from the table, carefully, as if hiding something. Then, one evening, he saw something odd: white granules clinging to the edge of his plate. They didn't look like salt or flour, and they hadn't been there before the food was served. Johann scraped a sample and brought it to a chemist named Dr. Loos, one of the few people in Bremen with the tools to test for toxins. Toxicology was still in its infancy, but what the doctor found was unmistakable: arsenic, a white, tasteless powder, commonly used to kill rats, or in some cases, people. With that, the image of the grieving widow shattered. Johann and Dr. Loos reported their findings to the authorities, but by then, Gesche had already fled. Whether she sensed suspicion or simply grew restless, no one knew. She traveled to Hanover, 135 kilometers away, where she took up residence with a friend. But wherever she went, death followed. Her friend, Bet Schmidt, and Bet's young daughter, Elise, fell ill within weeks. Both died soon after, then another acquaintance, then a creditor. Each case eerily familiar, always with Gesche nearby, always with food involved. It wasn't until 1828, on her 43rd birthday, that authorities finally caught up with her. She was arrested and brought back to Bremen, where the city, once so full of sympathy, was forced to confront the woman they had once called a saint. to many, it still didn't feel real. This was a woman who had suffered so visibly, who had helped so many, who had stood beside countless deathbeds with grace. The accusation seemed impossible, but for those who understood the patterns, for the investigators who had begun to treat this as a case of true crime rather than a string of coincidences, there was no longer any doubt. The criminal psychology was becoming clear. She hadn't just killed for gain. She had killed with patience, with planning, with complete control, and perhaps most disturbingly, she had killed with a smile. Gesche's arrest sent a tremor through Bremen, not because people feared her, but because they didn't want to believe it could be her. For years, she had been held up as a symbol of endurance, of quiet strength, of feminine virtue in the face of overwhelming loss. To accept that this same woman, so graceful in grief, so present in the suffering of others, had orchestrated those very deaths, was to question the community's own ability to see truth. And yet, the evidence was building. When news of the charges broke, it wasn't only the grieving families who reacted, it was the entire city. People remembered details that hadn't seemed odd at the time, how illness always seemed to follow her presence, how she often insisted on preparing meals herself, how her companions had a habit of dying just as debts or obligations came due. The case became one of the most talked about stories in Germany, even before it reached trial. It was no longer just a local tragedy. It had become a national spectacle, the kind that fuels every generation of true crime documentary with disbelief and morbid fascination. Inside the prison walls, Gesche didn't speak much at first. She denied the accusations calmly, as though this were just another hardship she would weather with dignity. But as the months passed and the names piled up, her resistance began to waver. One by one, investigators confronted her with accounts, witnesses, chemical evidence, and slowly she began to confess, not just to one death, but to 15. 15 lives extinguished, husbands, children, parents, friends, not in moments of rage, but through the careful ritual of arsenic-laced food. And those were only the ones she admitted to. Her method was deceptively simple. She mixed a blend of lard and arsenic, poison intended for rats, and spread it on bread and cakes. It was tasteless, undetectable by her victims. And because she administered it slowly, over time, the symptoms mimicked natural illness. To the untrained eye, it looked like disease. To her, it looked like control. The longer she was held, the more she seemed to unravel. Some guards later reported that she spoke to the ghosts of her victims. Others said she would cry and then, minutes later, return to her calm, elegant self. Whether it was guilt, madness, or simply performance, no one could say for sure. When the trial finally opened 3 years later, the courtroom overflowed. Reporters filled the gallery, onlookers gathered outside. Everyone wanted to see the woman who had deceived an entire city. Her defense attorney argued that she was not of sound mind, that no sane woman could poison those she loved without reason. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They described a woman who thrived on being needed, who created illness in others so she could play the role of caregiver. They spoke not of greed, but of a deeper hunger, one that psychologists today might label as a form of narcissistic manipulation or factitious disorder. It was a textbook case of what we now recognize in criminal psychology as a compulsion to control through care, weaponized nurturing. She didn't kill to eliminate, she killed to be essential. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, the courtroom was silent. There was no celebration, no cheers, only a cold understanding that something deeply unnatural had unfolded in their midst for years, hidden behind the ordinary. Gesche was sentenced to death. Her execution was scheduled to take place in Bremen's Cathedral Square, a public event, as was customary at the time. She was told she would be allowed one final glass of wine, and she requested it calmly, sipping it slowly before returning the cup to the judge. But there was one thing that seemed to matter more than the sentence itself. She was disappointed by the dress she was given to wear. Not the verdict, not the execution, the dress. And perhaps in that single detail, she revealed more about herself than any confession ever could. When the blade fell in Bremen's Cathedral Square on April 21st, 1831, the city closed a chapter that had spent years refusing to read. Gesche Gottfried, once seen as a pillar of compassion, became a cautionary tale, one that forced an entire community to confront how deeply they had been deceived. Her execution, the last public one in the city's history, marked more than the end of a life. It exposed a collective blind spot, the willingness of a society to confuse sorrow with virtue, to assume that suffering automatically makes someone good. In Gesche's case, that assumption proved fatal for 15 people. For years, she had lived not in the shadows, but in full view, serving, smiling, and soothing, even as she slowly orchestrated the deaths of those who trusted her most. And because she did so while performing the role of the ideal woman, devoted, gentle, nurturing, no one thought to question her. That, perhaps, is the most disturbing element of her story. It wasn't simply the poison or the number of victims that set her apart. It was the fact that her crimes were committed within the very framework that society taught her to embody. She didn't reject her role. She weaponized it. For scholars of criminal psychology, Gesche remains an unsettling study in power dynamics, emotional manipulation, and the darker side of social expectation. Her case challenges our assumptions not just about criminals, but about the very images we associate with goodness. It reminds us that trust, once given freely, can become the most dangerous vulnerability of all. Today, her name rarely appears outside the pages of true crime history, yet her legacy lingers quietly, uncomfortably, in the background of every story where someone too kind, too composed, and too selfless turns out to be something else entirely. And as we revisit her life through the lens of this true crime documentary, we're left not only with the horror of what she did, but with the question that haunts us long after the facts fade. If someone like Gesche Gottfried could be hiding behind a smile, who else might be? After hearing this story, I'm sure many of you are asking yourselves, if people who were once seen as ordinary can become killers, how many other dark corners are there in the human mind that we've never known about? Don't leave just yet. Stay here with me for the next episode. Together, we'll try to find the answer. Now, let's move on to the next case. Vienna, 1930s. A city of music, elegance, and secrets best left buried. In a time when the world tried to heal after the Great War, another kind of darkness quietly took root in the heart of Austria. Among the narrow streets and grand ballrooms, a young woman named Martha Marek wove her web, a story so chilling it would echo through the annals of true crime history. She wasn't the monster hiding in the shadows. She was the monster smiling at you from across the table. What makes someone cross that invisible line between desperate survivor and cold-blooded serial killer? Tonight, on Case X, True Crime and Psychology, we open one of the most twisted chapters in historical crime cases, the case of Martha Marek. The woman who turned love, loyalty, and family into deadly weapons. Stay with me. This story doesn't just walk into darkness. It runs. Martha Marek was born in 1904 in the heart of Vienna, Austria. A city draped in splendor, towering cathedrals, golden music halls, yet her own world was much smaller and much harsher. Orphaned at an early age, Martha was passed from one struggling family to another. She learned quickly that in Vienna, Beauty was currency, and she had none to spend. By the age of 15, she was working long hours in a modest dress shop, her future as threadbare as the gowns she mended. And then, a turn of fate. Mortis Fritsch, a wealthy, aging department store owner, 74 years old to her 16th. He saw something in Martha, or perhaps he saw what she would become. He made her his legal ward, whisking her away from the dust and hunger of her old life. Overnight, Martha was introduced to a world she had only ever pressed her nose against. Gilded parlors, finishing schools in France and England, private carriages waiting at midnight. The transformation was intoxicating. In the golden glow of Paris salons among the daughters of dukes and bankers, Martha learned an unforgiving lesson. Poverty wasn't just uncomfortable, it was shameful. And she made herself a silent vow, never again. When Martha returned to Vienna, carrying with her the polish of foreign education and the scent of faraway cities, Mortis Fritsch kept his promise. He left her everything, the mansion, the money, the illusion of permanence. But stability is a fragile thing, and Vienna in the 1920s was a city where fortunes could evaporate overnight. Among gilded mirrors and dusty chandeliers, Martha found something she hadn't been looking for. Emil Marek, a young, handsome engineer with bright ambitions and little wealth to his name. They met, they smiled, they whispered dreams into each other's ears. It wasn't scandalous, it was inevitable. In 1924, they married, stepping into what should have been a beautiful life, backed by a sizable inheritance. For a while, Vienna opened its arms to them. They dined under golden chandeliers. They drove sleek motor cars past the Ringstrasse. They bought silk and perfumes without looking at the prices. They lived, not recklessly, but hungrily, as if trying to devour all the joys they had been denied in childhood. But money is like quicksand. The more you struggle to hold it, the faster it slips away. Within a few years, Martha and Emil found themselves facing a slow financial collapse. The mansion sold. The investments dried up. Debt collectors whispered at their gates. But the hardest thing for Martha wasn't losing the money. It was the looming specter of poverty she thought she had outrun forever. In the brutal mathematics of survival, Martha wasn't just fighting to keep her lifestyle. She was fighting to keep her dignity, her identity, her very sense of self. And in the twisted logic that often underpins historical crime cases, it's not desperation that creates monsters. It's pride. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was war. As the last echoes of their inheritance faded away, Martha and Emil Marek stood at a precipice. Vienna, once a city of bright futures, now loomed around them like a vast, cold expanse they could no longer afford to inhabit. Debt crept into every corner of their lives. Bills stacked like silent accusations. Even the grand mansion, once a symbol of their escape from poverty, now seemed to sneer at their failures. But surrender was not in Martha's nature. She had clawed her way out of misery once. She would not go back. And so, in the suffocating twilight of desperation, a plan began to take shape. A plan that would push them both into the dark side of true crime history. They would fake a catastrophic accident, one so tragic, so grotesquely believable that the insurance company would have no choice but to pay out. It wasn't enough to slip and fall. Number. To secure a fortune, the accident needed blood, sacrifice, and spectacle. Emil, loyal and equally desperate, agreed to do the unthinkable. He would amputate his own leg. On a gray afternoon, in the quiet seclusion of their garden, Emil gripped an axe with trembling hands and swung at his own left leg. The blade struck flesh, but the damage was not sufficient. Pain and terror flooded him, but it was Martha, cool, determined Martha, who took the axe from his weakening hands and delivered the final necessary blows. Blood soaked the earth. Emil collapsed, his screams cutting through the heavy summer air, shattering the silence of the neighborhood. Martha called for help with frantic, practiced urgency. A doctor arrived quickly, and Emil was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons completed the amputation. Within days, Martha filed a substantial insurance claim, the largest accident claim Austria had seen since the end of the Great War. On the surface, it appeared to be a tragic misfortune, a freak accident, a young wife's worst nightmare. But something about the story didn't sit right with the insurance investigators. They began to dig deeper. Hospital reports noted inconsistencies. 3 distinct wounds, each made from a different angle, suggesting not a single accident, but multiple deliberate strikes. Rumors began to spread like wildfire. Whispers in Vienna's narrow streets questioned how a man could injure himself so precisely, and whether his wife might have played a more active role than anyone dared to imagine. Facing the collapse of their scheme, and with it, the return of the poverty she feared above all, Martha acted with reckless urgency. She approached a young surgical assistant, offering a bribe to alter the hospital records. If he would testify that the additional injuries were the result of medical mishandling, the insurance company would have no grounds to deny the claim. But greed begets greed. When the assistant demanded more money, money Martha could not produce, he turned to the authorities instead. On March 28, 1927, Martha and Emil Marek were arrested. Their trial drew enormous public attention. In a world still reeling from the scars of war and economic collapse, it was difficult for many to believe that a man could harm himself so viciously, or that a woman, his wife, could help him do it. Sympathy ran high. Doubt clouded the air. Medical experts couldn't agree. Some claimed the injuries could have been accidental. Others pointed to evidence of deliberate mutilation. In the end, the jury found the couple not guilty of insurance fraud, but convicted them of attempting to corrupt justice. Their punishment was minor: 4 months, a sentence they had already served while awaiting trial. As they stepped out of the courthouse into a sea of flashing cameras and curious onlookers, Vienna seemed to forgive them. But Martha Marek had crossed a threshold that day. In the murky waters of desperation and pride, she discovered something even more powerful than survival: the belief that she could beat the system and win. In Case X, True Crime and Psychology, this is where many stories turn darker. And Martha's story was about to descend into depths even she could not have foreseen. After the trial, after the flashing cameras and public sympathy had faded into whispers, Martha Marek faced a grim reality. They were broke. What little they had salvaged from the insurance settlement was consumed by legal fees.
Wow.
Their reputation, though outwardly intact, carried an invisible stain that made opportunities scarce. Desperation returned, not as a sudden storm, but as a slow, relentless tide. In the world of historical crime cases, many stories pivot at a single moment. For Martha, that moment came with a simple, chilling realization. Accidents were unreliable, but death was final. The slow transformation from desperate survivor to calculated predator had begun. In the summer of 1933, Martha and Emil, now with 2 young children, found themselves living in a poor district of Vienna. Emil's physical limitations after his amputation made steady work nearly impossible. Poverty gnawed at them, day by day, until even meals became uncertain luxuries. It was then that Emil, once so full of life and resolve, fell ill. His health declined with alarming speed. He lost weight rapidly. His vision blurred, his strength withered. On July 31st, 1933, he died in hospital, the doctors citing tuberculosis as the cause. A small insurance policy was paid out to Martha, and with it, a dark affirmation took root. Death could be profitable. Just weeks later, tragedy struck again. Their 7-year-old daughter, once vibrant and full of laughter, succumbed to a sudden, unexplained illness. Her eyes dimmed, her small body grew frail, and she slipped away before anyone could fully understand what was happening. Again, a modest insurance policy softened the blow, at least financially. But for Martha, something inside had already snapped. Love, loyalty, maternal instinct, all were now subordinate to survival and greed. In the grim catalog of serial killer behavior, many killers start close to home. Martha Marek was no exception. By the spring of 1934, Martha turned her gaze outward, toward the few remaining relatives who could still offer some advantage. She reconnected with her great-aunt, Suzanne Lowenstein, a 67-year-old widow who lived alone, clutching a small but comfortable inheritance. Flattered by Martha's sudden attentiveness, Suzanne changed her will, making Martha her sole heir. Within weeks, Suzanne's health began to fail. First, her sight dimmed, then her hair fell out. Her legs weakened, leaving her bedridden. On July 17, 1934, Suzanne died. Martha, ever efficient, collected her inheritance and immediately spent it, barely pausing to mourn. With her funds once again dwindling, Martha turned her inherited home into a boarding house. Among her first tenants was a woman named Mrs. Kittenberger. History often repeats itself in the grim annals of true crime, and what happened next was no exception. Mrs. Kittenberger, once robust and independent, soon began exhibiting the same chilling symptoms: failing eyesight, loss of strength, sudden frailty. By June 2, 1935, Mrs. Kittenberger was dead. Martha promptly presented yet another life insurance policy to claim her due. But this time, there were witnesses, or at least suspicions. Mrs. Kittenberger's son, Herbert, confronted Martha, accusing her outright of murder. Martha had him arrested for slander, and the authorities, lacking evidence, dismissed the charge. Emboldened by her apparent invincibility, Martha's methods grew bolder. In 1937, facing mounting debts again, she shifted her strategy slightly. Instead of insuring people, she insured valuable paintings inherited from Suzanne. One night, she arranged for several pieces to be removed and hidden, then reported the artwork stolen. But Martha's luck had soured. The insurance company, already wary after previous large claims, called in an investigator, Detective Peters, the same man who had once investigated the amputated leg incident. Peters canvassed warehouses across Vienna and soon located the missing paintings untouched. Martha Marek was arrested for fraud, and in a chilling twist fitting of the darkest chapters in Case X, True Crime and Psychology, her past atrocities began to unravel. Herbert Kittenberger, still mourning his mother, came forward once more, insisting that Martha had poisoned Mrs. Kittenberger. His claims prompted authorities to exhume the bodies of Martha's husband, daughter, great-aunt, and boarder. Toxicology reports revealed a horrific truth. All had been poisoned with thallium, a rare and deadly chemical compound. Slow, agonizing, and virtually undetectable at the time, thallium robbed its victims of sight, movement, and eventually, life itself. Even worse, detectives traced the purchase of the poison directly back to Martha herself. In a desperate attempt to claim one more insurance payout, she had even poisoned her surviving young son. a final
Ngay sau
monstrous
khi gợi ý
act
nhà văn
that
Zika,
narrowly failed
Rowling được hé
only
lộ,
because he
ca
was
sĩ Khánh
rescued
Ly
in
đã lập tức
time.
đổi đáp án từ
It
có
was
năng
no
sang
longer a
Harry
question
Potter.
of bad luck
Liệu
or
lựa chọn nhanh nhạy
unfortunate
này có giúp cô
coincidence.
giành chọn bùng chọn
Martha Marek
ý
had crossed
nhà văn
fully
Zika?
into infamy.
Rowling được hé lộ,
She
ca
was
sĩ
no
Khánh Ly
longer
đã
a
lập tức đổi
desperate
đáp án
widow
từ
or
có
a
năng
mother
sang
in
Harry.
mourning. She was a serial killer, hiding behind the delicate facade of Vienna's lost elegance, a case study in human depravity that would haunt the annals of historical crime cases for decades to come. And soon, she would stand trial, not for fraud, not for lies, but for murder on a scale that chilled even the most hardened detectives. By the time Martha Marek stood before the court, the whispers had grown into a roar. Vienna, a city steeped in elegance and tradition, found itself grappling with a dark spectacle unlike any in its recent memory. It was May 2nd, 1938, when Martha's trial for murder officially began. Such was the public's fascination that the Ministry of Justice moved the proceedings to the Great Hall of the courthouse, a space usually reserved for the most consequential trials of the era. The media labeled her a devil in petticoats, a chilling figure wrapped not in chains, but in the quiet, unassuming clothing of mourning. But behind the black veil, the prosecution argued, was a mind sharpened by greed and unbound by conscience. The evidence was overwhelming. More than 100 witnesses were called to testify. A chemist took the stand, describing how Martha had purchased unusual quantities of rat poison, so much, in fact, that he had to place special orders with his suppliers.
Ngay sau khi gợi ý nhà văn Joan Kathleen Rowling được hé lộ, ca sĩ Khánh Ly đã lập tức đổi đáp án từ có năng sang Harry Potter. Liệu lựa chọn
systematic suffering. Friends and neighbors recalled Martha's peculiar indifference during the illnesses and deaths of those around her. Even her surviving son, a fragile boy still recovering from the effects of the poison, became a symbol of how deep her betrayal had gone. In a particularly devastating moment, a neighbor testified that the boy had once said, "I shall soon go to heaven. My mother told me so." In the realm of true crime, some stories rattle even the most seasoned courtrooms, and Martha's was among them. Yet through it all,
Ngay sau khi gợi
Martha
ý nhà văn
maintained her innocence. Calm, composed, and articulate, she denied every accusation. But denials could not erase the trail of death, nor the meticulous records tying her hand to each tragedy. The jury and the judges deliberated carefully, but the verdict was never truly in doubt. On May 19, 1938, Martha Marek was found guilty of multiple counts of murder. The sentence was clear, final, and unflinching: death. In Austria at the time, the method of execution was beheading, a punishment carried out swiftly, with grim formality, and without public spectacle. On December 6, 1938, Martha met her end at dawn. The details of her final moments remain sparing in the historical record, fitting for a society that preferred discretion over morbid fascination. What is remembered, however, is that she died swiftly, leaving behind a legacy that would ripple through Vienna's collective memory for decades. In the broader context of historical crime cases, Martha Marek's story serves as a chilling reminder that the line between desperation and monstrosity can blur until it vanishes entirely. Case X. True crime and psychology often seeks to understand not just the crimes, but the fragile human psyche behind them. And Martha's mind remains one of the darkest studies of all. In the end, Vienna moved on. Streets bustled, music played, laughter returned to cafes and parks. But the shadow she cast lingered, a quiet warning whispered through generations, that even amid beauty, darkness can thrive, waiting, patient, behind the
Ngay sau
softest
khi gợi ý nhà
smiles.
văn Joan Kathleen
In
Rowling
the
được hé
quiet
lộ,
that
ca sĩ
followed
Khánh
Martha
Ly đã
Marek's
lập tức đổi đáp
execution,
án từ có năng
Vienna
sang
seemed
Harry
eager to move
Potter màn
on.
hình.
The newspapers turned their pages. The crowds returned to the cafes and theaters, seeking music, laughter, and light. But for those who had followed the trial, For those who had glimpsed the smiling woman beneath whose touch death had bloomed, forgetting was never so simple. Martha's story entered the grim tapestry of true crime history, a reminder that evil does not always arrive with a snarl and a blade. Sometimes it comes dressed in velvet gloves and soft words. Her case remains a chilling entry among the annals of historical crime cases, not because of how loudly she committed her crimes, but because of how quietly she wove them into the fabric of everyday life. In Case X, True Crime and Psychology, we often ask, was the monster born or made? In Martha's life, we find no easy answers. Was it the desperate hunger born from a childhood of deprivation? Was it the intoxicating taste of wealth and status that she could not bear to lose? Or was it something deeper, a darkness latent all along, waiting for hardship to fan it into flame? In the study of serial killer psychology, Martha Marek stands as a unique figure, not driven by rage or ideology or even hatred, but by the cold, creeping corrosion of pride and greed. She was not a victim of her circumstances alone. She made choices. Small ones at first, almost invisible, then larger, until the woman who once dreamed of beautiful dresses and grand houses became the architect of death, trading human lives for fleeting comforts. In the end, Martha's tragedy is not just the destruction she wrought on others. It is the destruction she wrought upon herself, piece by piece, soul by soul. A cautionary tale whispered through time, that when survival becomes ambition, and ambition rots into entitlement, even the most ordinary lives can descend into the darkest corners of human nature. Some monsters, it seems, are not born screaming into the night. They are born quietly, smiling. Now, let's move on to the next case. When the truck finally stopped, its engine stuttering into silence and bodies lying motionless on the pavement, she didn't flee. She didn't scream or try to explain. Instead, she remained behind the wheel, composed and quiet, like someone who had just completed a necessary task. And when the officers approached, confused and horrified by what they were seeing, she looked up and told them without hesitation, "No, I meant to do it." Her name was Olga Hepnarova. She was 23 years old, born in a city already scarred by war and silence. And what she did that morning would make her the last woman ever executed in Czechoslovakia. This wasn't a crime of passion or impulse. It was deliberate, planned. The final act of a young woman who believed the world had never wanted her and who decided at last to respond in kind. 2 days before she struck, she sent letters to local newspapers. In them, she wrote not as a woman seeking pity, but as someone delivering a verdict. I, Olga Hepnarova, the victim of your cruelty, sentence you to death. What drives a human being to that edge and convinces them there's nothing left to return to? This is not a story of evil in disguise. It is the story of someone society forgot, and of what can happen when isolation is no longer silent, but speaks violently for itself. When isolation is no longer silent, but erupts destructively into the world. Olga Hepnarova was born in Prague in the summer of 1951, a city still carrying the heavy silence left behind by war. At first glance, her world seemed stable. Her father worked as a bank clerk, her mother was a dentist, and their family belonged to the post-war middle class. Modest, but respectable. But what looked normal from the outside was far from calm on the inside. From a young age, Olga struggled to connect with classmates, with teachers, and even with her own family. She didn't lash out or break rules. Instead, she withdrew. While other children played and laughed easily, Olga often stood at the edges, watching, quiet, alone. By the time she was a teenager, those feelings had turned inward. At just 13, She went through a period of emotional collapse that led to extended observation at a mental health center. There, doctors noted signs of emotional distress, detachment, and deep apathy. One report mentioned she struggled to speak openly, even when asked simple questions. Another described her as someone carrying an unbearable weight she couldn't name. After nearly a year of observation, she was released. But nothing had changed at home. She returned to the same rooms, the same strained conversations, the same emotional silence. She later told professionals that she felt crushed by her family environment, that her voice didn't matter, that her pain was invisible. And in a society where emotional well-being was rarely discussed and mental health support was nearly non-existent, that silence was left to grow. As Olga got older, she tried to do what was expected of her. She looked for work, took on small jobs, tried to follow the rhythm of adult life. But she couldn't hold a position for more than a few days. Every workplace became another reminder that she didn't fit. She was quiet, awkward, slow to trust. And in return, people kept their distance. With each rejection, she withdrew further. And somewhere along the way, her isolation no longer felt like bad luck. It began to feel permanent, inescapable. She began spending long hours alone, walking the same streets, sitting on the same park benches, watching people live lives she no longer believed she could reach. Not angry, not yet, but worn down, tired, and starting to ask the kind of questions that go unanswered far too long. Why does no one care? Why does no one ask? At 21, she earned a license to drive trucks, one of the few jobs that didn't require talking, didn't demand a smile, didn't expect much more than silence. For a while, that helped. It gave her distance, control, space. But space can only hold so much. And loneliness, once it grows past a certain point, doesn't just stay quiet. It begins to look for a way out. By her early 20s, Olga was no longer just quiet. She was vanishing. She drifted further from what most people would call a life. No friends, no family ties, no direction. The world kept moving, but she stood still in the middle of it, like a blurry figure caught between layers of silence. Her apartment was sparse and small. Her routine, if it could even be called that, was made of long walks, short contracts, and days that passed without a single conversation. What she craved wasn't luxury, success, or even happiness. It was acknowledgement, a glance that lasted long enough to say, "You exist, I see you." But that never came. According to documents later reviewed in her true crime investigation, neighbors described her as distant but polite. Former employers said she was difficult to engage with, slow to respond, uncomfortable even in routine exchanges. Some simply thought she was odd. No one, it seemed, thought she was hurting. That invisibility, slow, persistent, and humiliating, became her reality. In one of the few recorded statements from her early psychiatric assessments, Olga wrote something that would later haunt those who studied her case. "I live among people, but I am not one of them." This wasn't a woman looking for excuses. It was a woman who couldn't find a bridge back to the world no matter how far she walked. In the context of criminal psychology, Olga's profile is unusual. Not because of her violence, but because of how long she carried the weight of her suffering before ever expressing it outward. Many offenders in high-profile true crime documentary cases exhibit warning signs: outbursts, aggression, visible instability. But Olga, she simply disappeared behind her own eyes, and no one noticed. Years later, analysts would look at her handwriting, tight, slanted, compressed, and call it a symptom. They would examine her childhood drawings, her high school essays, and search for early traces of rage. But there were none. Only loneliness. Only the dull echo of someone who never felt welcome. She wasn't born bitter. She became so piece by piece. through every silent meal, every day without purpose, every moment someone walked past her like she wasn't even there. And then one day, something shifted. She didn't want to fade anymore. She wanted the world to notice, to hear her name and remember it. In one of her most chilling letters, sent days before everything changed, she wrote, "I have been silent long enough. Now I will become the noise." It wasn't just a sentence. It was a breaking point. And in the landscape of true crime, it marks a tragic transition from forgotten woman to a name the world would never unhear, from someone we pity to someone the world would never forget. The first trace of what was to come didn't arrive through a siren or an eyewitness. It came folded, quiet, and late. On the 7th of July, 1973, Olga Hepnarova mailed 2 letters. Each one was addressed to a newspaper editor. They weren't cries for help. They weren't incoherent ramblings. They were calm, methodical declarations. In one, she wrote, "I am a loner, a woman destroyed by people. I have a choice, to end my life or to end the lives of others. My verdict is this: I sentence you to death." At the time, no one saw it. The letters would not be opened until 2 days after her actions had already etched themselves into Prague's memory. By then, the world around her had already changed. But the words still cut through the silence like a second blow. For a moment, disbelief softened the headlines. Many refused to accept that the quiet, withdrawn woman they barely remembered could be responsible for something so devastating. Olga had no record, no history of violence, no public breakdown. She was invisible in the way that doesn't raise alarms, just questions people forget to ask. But as investigators retraced her steps, that invisibility began to wear off. She had arrived at the rental office on time, passed her driving test without incident, and selected her vehicle with precision. She paid in full, signed without hesitation, drove calmly out of the lot. There were no mechanical failures, no signs of panic, no variables left to chance. Nothing about what happened was accidental. And when police searched her apartment, they found no chaos, only quiet control. There were notebooks filled with entries, marked calendars, clippings from local newspapers. It wasn't the environment of someone unraveling. It was the workspace of someone preparing. To an ordinary observer, Olga might have seemed like someone who had simply snapped. But to those familiar with criminal psychology, her behavior fit another pattern entirely, a prolonged collapse disguised as calm. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was a slow build towards something she believed was justified. And in the context of true crime, that distinction changes everything. In the following weeks, friends, neighbors, and former colleagues were interviewed again. Stories they had once dismissed as odd now returned with unease. A neighbor recalled seeing her standing at a tram stop for a long time, doing nothing, just staring. Another remembered how she always walked the same paths at the same hour, as if rehearsing something no one else was allowed to know. Separately, these moments felt like quirks. Together, they sketched the outline of intent. Even the language of her letters, once read as abstract or emotional, began to reveal a logic behind the rage. Olga hadn't been overwhelmed. She had been planning to act and waiting for the moment when she no longer wanted to hide it. What unsettled the city most wasn't just what had happened. It was the realization that she had left traces, and no one had followed them. Her silence hadn't been empty. It had been full of signs, but we only see signs when we know to look for them. And in her case, by the time anyone did, it was already far too late. Among those studying the case, investigators, psychologists, and true crime documentary writers, There was no single consensus on what pushed her past the edge, but they all agreed on one thing. This wasn't just a woman at war with herself. It was someone who believed the world had sentenced her long before she ever acted. And in her own words, this was merely her reply. She had made her choice days before anyone else knew it. Not in anger, not in desperation, but in quiet conviction. On the morning of July 10th, 1973, Olga Hepnarova walked into a rental office in Prague. She showed her license, signed her name, and handed over 260 crowns in cash. There were no questions, no hesitation. She took the keys, climbed into the cab of a medium-sized truck, and drove off without looking back. To the man who handed her the keys, she was just another customer. To the city, just another face blending into the background. But to Olga, this was the day her silence would finally speak. She circled the streets for nearly an hour, not lost, observing. Watching the ebb and flow of pedestrians, measuring the density of crowds, calculating. She passed several tram stops before deciding on one at the bottom of a sloped road in the Prague 7 district. It was the perfect vantage point. The incline would give her momentum. The corner made it hard for anyone to see her coming. She noted the timing of the crowds, when the most people gathered, then she waited. But something felt off. There were people, but not enough. Not yet. She didn't turn back. Instead, she circled again. This wasn't hesitation, it was optimization. By the time she returned to the top of the hill, the crowd had swelled. Elderly men, commuters, parents with small children, people standing in line for a tram, thinking of groceries, work, or nothing at all. People who had no reason to look behind them. She didn't stop. The machine moved forward, steady, inevitable. And then, silence broke. In the minutes that followed, the city froze. Emergency crews rushed in. Sirens echoed through the narrow streets. Witnesses screamed, some frozen in place, others scattered in panic. 9 lives were lost that day, quietly and without warning. Some carried marks you could see. Most carried ones you couldn't. But Olga didn't run. She stepped out of the truck and waited. When police arrived, they found her calm. She told them there had been no accident, no malfunction. This was her decision. She said it simply, like someone announcing that dinner was ready. No emotion, no panic, just certainty. Later, she would say, there were no cars, no trams, nothing in the way. I said to myself, this is the time. For investigators, the hardest part wasn't the action. It was the absence of emotion around it. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She didn't offer excuses. From a criminal psychology standpoint, this placed her far from the profile of someone who snapped. There was planning, strategy, intention. In the context of true crime, this wasn't a case of passion or impulse. It was something colder, more deliberate, and perhaps more frightening. In court, she refused to plead insanity. Her lawyer tried to present evidence of her emotional instability, but she rejected it. She told the judge she was aware of her actions, that this was not an outburst, but a sentence. Her sentence, delivered to a society she believed had condemned her first. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't express regret. She said, if society destroys individuals, individuals can destroy society. It wasn't a defense. It was a verdict, cold and deeply personal. And in that moment, the person the city once ignored, the quiet girl, the strange neighbor, the truck driver no one looked twice at, became something else entirely. Not just a name in a court file, but a chapter in true crime documentary history. She didn't try to run, nor did she resist when authorities arrived. Instead, Olga remained exactly where she was, still, composed, and strangely present in a moment that should have overwhelmed most people. She offered no excuse, no panic, no confusion. To the outside world, it looked almost rehearsed. And in a way, it was. When the trial began in 1974, the courtroom didn't erupt with outrage. It quieted. People watched closely, but the silence came not from indifference, rather from disbelief. What had unfolded weeks earlier now had to be understood under the weight of law. Olga Hepnarova was just 23 years old. She appeared calm, still, withdrawn. Her lawyer, experienced and persistent, stood beside her, armed with records of her psychiatric past and testimonies of emotional instability dating back to her teenage years. But Olga dismissed all of it. She told the court that she had acted with full awareness, that she needed no defense, that if the court wished to pass judgment, she would not argue. Her statement was not a plea. It was a conclusion. If society destroys individuals, she told the court, then individuals can destroy society. There was no need for speculation. The facts were laid out clearly. Witnesses were present. Her written declarations left no room for doubt. And yet, the questions before the court reached far beyond the event itself. What do you do with a person who believes harm is their only remaining language? And what does it say about the society surrounding them if they might not be entirely wrong? The public followed closely. Some called it unthinkable. Others said it was inevitable. Legal experts, prison officials, and mental health professionals, especially those working in criminal psychology, all found themselves examining a case that didn't align with existing models. Olga did not fit the profile of someone unwell in the traditional sense. She showed no signs of delusion, no violent history, no desire for recognition. She hadn't tried to flee. She hadn't even denied anything. Instead, she had prepared, acted, and then waited for the consequences, detached yet intentional. This made her case unique in the annals of true crime documentary analysis. After weeks of proceedings, the outcome became official. On April 6th, 1974, Olga Hepnarova was found guilty on all counts. Appeals were submitted on her behalf and promptly denied. The Czech Supreme Court upheld the sentence. A final request for clemency, submitted by her mother to the Prime Minister, was also refused. Her final date was set for March 12, 1975. To reporters, Olga claimed she was ready. She said she understood the process and accepted the decision. She spoke of it not with fear, but with the same quiet clarity she had shown throughout the proceedings. But when that day arrived, her composure faltered. As the guard opened her cell, she collapsed. Her calm unraveled into visible fear. The stillness she had once held cracked open into panic. She cried. Her body trembled. She pleaded for the very mercy she had once dismissed as unnecessary. And yet the process moved forward, just as the court had declared. That morning, Olga Hepnarova ceased to be a defendant. She became a reference point, a line in legal history, a subject of scholarly review, in textbooks, in psychological journals, in university lecture halls, in documentaries dissecting the darker patterns of alienation and collapse within modern society. And across every telling, one question remained. Had she been born to destroy, or was she created by a world that refused to see her? The girl, who once moved through Prague unnoticed, had now become a fixed point, not remembered for her life, but for the sentence she chose to deliver. Olga Hepnarova's name did not disappear after the court rendered its decision. It remained quietly, uncomfortably, carried through academic discussion, court transcripts, and the background of true crime documentary scripts that would revisit her story for years to come. She became more than a defendant. She became a mirror, reflecting not only a singular act, but a broader failure that few wanted to admit. In the decades since, many have attempted to explain her through the lens that suited them best. Some argued she was emotionally unwell, shaped by untreated psychological wounds. Others saw her as a symbol of revenge, someone who had internalized the cruelty of others until she turned it outward. But perhaps what unsettled people most, especially those working in criminal psychology, was how familiar her life had seemed before it collapsed. She didn't belong to any political group. She didn't leave behind a manifesto or public declaration beyond the letters she mailed. Her background wasn't filled with earlier violence or threats. There were no signs that screamed, only signs that whispered and were ignored. What remained was something harder to categorize: the slow erosion of trust, connection, and meaning in the life of someone others had chosen not to see. She was the last woman in Czechoslovakia to receive that level of sentencing. And after her case, conversations began to shift. Not just about justice, but about silence, mental health, and whether the systems built to respond were truly designed to notice the ones who never ask for help. Because Olga didn't shout. She waited. She lingered in doorways, at tram stops, and in the margins of other people's lives, hoping, maybe, that someone might see past the quiet. By the time she made herself visible, it was far too late to reverse what had already been set in motion. There are no excuses for what she did. And yet, the deeper question persists. What could have been done differently, long before her name became synonymous with devastation? The story of Olga Hepnarova is not simply a story of harm. It is a story of a society that mistook silence for stability and absence of conflict for peace. It is a reminder that even in the quietest lives, storms can form unnoticed. And once they arrive, there may be no way to turn them back. Now, let's move on to the next case. If you walked past her on the street, you probably wouldn't have looked twice. She was small, polite, dressed simply, carrying herself with quiet purpose. People said she was helpful, that she was religious, that she cared for children. But behind the walls of her modest apartment in Copenhagen, Denmark, something unthinkable was happening. Babies were disappearing, and no one, not even the mothers who trusted her, suspected a thing. Between 1913 and 1920, at least 16 infants were handed over to her care. Some were born out of wedlock. Some were hidden from families. All were given up by women looking for a second chance. They gave her money, they gave her their babies, and they walked away, believing they'd done the right thing. But Dagmar Overby wasn't finding them new homes. She was ending their lives, quietly, methodically, and without remorse. And for years, no one noticed. This isn't just a story about a killer. It's about how she got away with it, about the mothers who were silenced, the babies no one looked for, and the kind of society that created the perfect conditions for a woman like Dagmar to become a monster. So how does someone go from caregiver to executioner? Was she always like this, or did the world push her there? Let's go back, before the headlines, before the fire, before the country knew her name. Because to understand what she did, we have to understand who she was and what she survived before she became something else entirely. Dagmar Overby was born in 1887 in a quiet farming village where life was defined by survival, silence, and simplicity. Her parents were poor, hardworking, and distant, the kind of people who measured worth in chores completed and trouble avoided. From an early age, Dagmar stood out. She was intelligent, observant, and unusually intense for a child. But that intensity didn't translate into affection. Instead, it showed in small bursts of manipulation, petty theft, and defiance that her parents couldn't understand or tolerate. When she was 12, she was caught stealing from a neighbor. Not just candy or a toy, but a coin purse with enough money to matter. Her parents didn't punish her directly. They sent her away, shipped her off to a large farm on the island of Funen, where she worked long hours scrubbing floors, cooking, cleaning, and milking cows. She wasn't treated cruelly, but she wasn't a child anymore either. Not in any way that mattered. No one asked how she was doing. No one cared if she cried herself to sleep. By her late teens, she'd moved between several households, always working, always alone. The pattern repeated. She tried to stay invisible, but the urge to take what wasn't hers never quite left her. Eventually, she was arrested for theft and spent 10 days in a women's prison. It was shortamentralten Nair Sars Univeltweinsharn Myers Vantoren Sars, eventful and utterly formative, because when she returned home, nothing had changed except her sense of where she belonged. Nowhere. Trying to rebuild, she took a job as a waitress in a local cafe where she met Biscard, a regular customer with kind eyes and soft manners. For a moment, it looked like her life was beginning again. He cared for her, they moved in together, and soon after, she became pregnant. But what started as hope quickly unraveled. The baby died in infancy under unclear circumstances. The doctor listed the cause as pneumonia, but the signs, blue lips, limp limbs, suggested something else entirely. The townspeople whispered, Biscard drifted, and once again Dagmar was left behind, marked by loss and suspicion. She left town not long after and arrived in Copenhagen, determined to reinvent herself. That's where she met Jens Sorensen. What he didn't know was that she was already pregnant with another man's child. When the baby was born, Dagmar arranged for the child to be adopted immediately. It wasn't sentimentality or shame, it was strategy. She wanted Jens, and she knew that a child could ruin that. But hiding the truth didn't protect her for long. A year later, she became pregnant again, and this time, Jens told her to get rid of it. Abortion wasn't legal. The risk was enormous. She refused. When the baby came, she wrapped him in blankets and left him in a haystack. She had hoped Jens would forgive her. Instead, he left, cold, final, and without a word. That abandonment broke something inside her. She attempted suicide not long after. It didn't work. And when she survived, it was as if the last trace of softness had burned away. Trying to rebuild, she took a job as a waitress in a local cafe, where she met Biscard, a regular customer she eventually reunited with her daughter, the one she had given up, and tried again to build a life. She opened a sweet shop. She smiled at customers. She played the role. But the business failed. War made everything more expensive. People bought less, and the cracks began to show. That was when she discovered something darker, but more sustainable. While scanning the classifieds, she saw ads from desperate young women looking for adoptive families for their newborns. Women who couldn't keep their babies, women with no family support, no money, and no place in society. Women exactly like Dagmar had once been. And it clicked. These women didn't need her sympathy. They needed her silence. They needed someone to take the child and ask no questions. She could be that person. She told herself she was helping. She said the babies were going to better homes. She believed, maybe at first, that she was doing what no one else had the heart to do. And for the first time in a long time, people came to her. Not with judgment, but with trust. She took the child, she took the payment. And what happened after, no one asked. She eventually reunited with her daughter, the one she had given up, and tried again to build a life. She opened a sweet shop. She smiled at customers. She played the role, but the business failed. War made everything more expensive. People bought less, and the cracks began to show. That was when she discovered something darker but more sustainable. While scanning the classifieds, she saw ads from desperate young women looking for adoptive families for their newborns. women who couldn't keep their babies, women with no family support, no money, and no place in society. Women exactly like Dagmar had once been. And it clicked. These women didn't need her sympathy. They needed her silence. They needed someone to take the child and ask no questions. She could be that person. She told herself she was helping. She said the babies were going to better homes. She believed, maybe at first, that she was doing what no one else had the heart to do. And for the first time in a long time, people came to her. Not with judgment, but with trust. She took the child. She took the payment. And what happened after? No one asked. By the spring of 1916, Dagmar Overby had become something of a quiet fixture in her Copenhagen neighborhood. She kept to herself, raised her daughter, and presented the kind of life that, on the surface, appeared steady, unremarkable even. What people didn't see, and what Dagmar worked carefully to hide, was that she had found a way to turn shame into income. At the time, there was no greater shame in Danish society than being an unwed mother. These women were treated like pariahs, discarded by their families, judged by strangers, and given no real options for survival. Adoption, even if informal and unregulated, became the only path for many of them. And Dagmar offered exactly that. Discretion, no paperwork, and the promise of a better life for the child. One such woman was Rasmin Jensen, 26 years old and newly alone, who had given birth to a baby boy she couldn't keep. She posted a small ad in the paper, seeking a kind home. She wanted dignity for her son. She hoped someone out there might offer him what she couldn't. Dagmar answered the ad. When they met, Dagmar played her role perfectly. Gentle, calm, maternal. She promised that the baby would be placed with a good Christian family, and she reassured Rasmin that she would send occasional updates. In exchange, Rasmin handed over the infant, along with 12 kroner, just enough to cover the first month's care, with the understanding that more payments would follow. Dagmar walked away from that meeting with the baby in a pram, but she didn't head to any family home. She wandered the streets until she reached a public cemetery on the city's edge. There, she took the infant's life and disposed of him in a public latrine. 3 days passed before anyone found him. There was no name, no connection, just another forgotten tragedy. And yet, on the very day the body was discovered, Dagmar wrote to Rasmin. She told her that the child was well, peaceful, not crying at all. In a way, she wasn't lying, but the cruelty lay in the calmness. How easily she shifted from murder to reassurance without the slightest crack in her words. 2 weeks later, she did it again. Another child, another payment, another promise. This time, she left the body beneath a bridge, hidden in shadow and silence. But it wasn't just desperation driving her now. It was calculation. Dagmar realized this service had value, real, consistent value. The upfront payments were sizable, sometimes a full year's wage for a working woman. And if the mother continued sending money afterward, even better. Once the baby was gone, there were no expenses, no food, no clothing, no noise in the middle of the night. Only quiet, only profit. Still, disposing of the bodies in public spaces was beginning to feel risky. The discovery of even one could invite suspicion. 2, and people might begin to notice patterns. She needed a better way. In her apartment stood a masonry heater, a common fixture in older Danish homes. It was large, ceramic, and capable of reaching extreme temperatures, hot enough to turn bone to ash. Dagmar began using it. She waited for the right moments, when her daughter was out of the house or fast asleep. Then, investigators found traces, small, brittle fragments that spoke of something no one wanted to imagine, and mixed the ashes with the rest of the soot from the fireplace. It was clean, controlled, invisible. From that point forward, she no longer needed to worry about where to hide the evidence. There was nothing left to find. And the women? They continued to come. They arrived at her door with babies wrapped in blankets and fear tucked behind tired eyes. They left with hope, believing they'd done what was best, that they'd found someone to carry the burden for them. Dagmar told them what they needed to hear. She gave them a story to hold on to. Then she took the child, took the money, closed the door. She didn't feel remorse. Not exactly. She framed it differently in her mind. These children, she told herself, were already unwanted, forgotten. She was simply finishing what their mothers had started. That's how rationalization works. It doesn't need to be true. It only needs to feel like it could be. And once she believed it, it became easier. Much easier. By 1920, Dagmar Overby had refined her operation to near perfection. She answered newspaper ads. She offered certainty. She made the mothers believe their children were being given better lives, clean homes, warm beds, a second chance somewhere safe. And no one questioned her. She had processed so many infants by then, quietly, efficiently, that it no longer felt like risk. It felt like routine. She disposed of the remains. She ensured there was nothing left to find. She collected the payments. And when the mothers wrote, she replied. Polite, reassuring, convincing. But Dagmar hadn't accounted for one thing. Not every mother walks away and stays gone. Her name was Carolyn Agerskoff, a factory worker, young, unmarried, scared. Her family was deeply religious, and when she gave birth to a daughter, she was told, clearly, that the baby would not be allowed in the home. The officers were skeptical at first. After all, women changed their minds. They got emotional. They regretted decisions. But there was something in Caroline's voice, controlled, focused, scared, but not unstable, that made them pause. They visited Dagmar's apartment, and what they found unraveled everything. Investigators found traces, small, brittle fragments that spoke of something no one wanted to imagine. In a side drawer, baby clothes, photographs of children, some known, others unaccounted for, receipts, letters, money. Dagmar didn't deny any of it. She confessed to 16 murders, though investigators believed the true number might have been closer to 25, possibly more. She had kept no formal records, only fragments, only ashes. To this day, Dagmar Overby remains one of the most chilling figures in the history of historical crime cases. A woman, a mother, a killer. It shattered every assumption people had about femininity, motherhood, and safety. Dagmar had used societal silence as her cover, and now that silence was breaking. The public was horrified, but not just by the murders. They were horrified by what allowed them to happen. In cafes and churches and newspaper columns, the country asked, how had no one noticed? How many women had handed over their children and been too ashamed to ask questions? And what kind of system forced them to make those choices in the first place? The moral debate exploded. Dagmar's case wasn't just about guilt. It was about a society that punished women for becoming mothers and then abandoned them the moment they needed help. She was charged with 9 counts of murder. Those the police could confirm with physical evidence. In 1921, she stood trial. She didn't plead insanity. She didn't offer excuses. And yet, when the court sentenced her to death, something remarkable happened. The King of Denmark commuted her sentence to life imprisonment, stating simply, "We do not put our women to death." Dagmar Overby's trial began in March 1921, drawing a mix of curiosity, horror, and national shame. She entered the courtroom not as a grieving woman or a desperate mother, but with a calmness that unsettled everyone present. She didn't weep. She didn't plead. And most notably, she didn't deny what she had done. She had confessed to the murder of 16 infants, though investigators suspected the real number was even higher, possibly 25 or more. Yet only 9 charges were brought forward, the ones supported by physical evidence. Fragments of bone, clothing, photos, payment records, and the accounts of mothers who had finally come forward. The others had vanished into the fire, impossible to trace, impossible to prove. Dagmar made no attempt to defend herself with insanity. She didn't blame others. She didn't even offer an explanation. Her silence wasn't strategic. It was final. A courtroom full of people waited for something. Remorse, guilt, maybe even an apology. But she gave them nothing. The court sentenced her to death. It was a rare sentence in Denmark and almost unheard of for a woman. Many expected it to stand as an example. A clear message that what she had done was beyond redemption. But shortly after the verdict was announced, the King of Denmark intervened. He commuted the death sentence to life in prison, stating simply, "In Denmark, we do not put our women to death." That single decision created its own controversy. To some, it was mercy undeserved. To others, it was a reaffirmation of principle, an insistence that the justice system should not become a mirror of the horror it was punishing. Either way, Dagmar would spend the rest of her life behind bars, removed from the world she had quietly damaged for years. She died in prison in 1929 at the age of 42. No further trials, no interviews, no public reflections. The press moved on. The country moved on. But the weight of what had happened lingered in silence. Because this case, unlike any before it, had exposed something deeper than murder. It revealed the failures of a society that left women with no real choices. It uncovered the desperation of mothers, so abandoned by their families and shamed by their communities that handing their child to a stranger felt like the least terrible option. And it forced the public to reckon with the idea that evil doesn't always look like a monster. It can wear a dress, light a stove, and smile kindly as it closes the door. In the aftermath of the trial, Denmark changed its laws. For the first time, protections were created for children born out of wedlock. Foster care came under formal supervision. The state built homes for single mothers. It took the death of more than a dozen infants to make the country realize how deeply it had failed the most vulnerable among them. Not just the babies, but the mothers too. And yet, what still haunts this story isn't just the act of killing. It's how many people looked away. How many wanted to believe the lie because it was easier. How many institutions existed only to punish and not to protect. Because Dagmar didn't lure her victims off the street. She didn't break into homes or steal children from their cribs. The mothers came to her voluntarily, often in tears, often out of love, believing she could offer something they couldn't. She didn't take the babies. She was given them. And that's what makes her story so unbearable to sit with. It wasn't madness. It wasn't chaos. It was quiet, routine, efficient. When you remove all the horror and focus only on the method, what you're left with is a business model, born out of shame, sustained by silence, and paid for in trust. So, who was Dagmar Overby? Was she a woman so twisted by her past, abandonment, poverty, emotional violence, that she eventually collapsed into cruelty? Or was she something more chilling, a person who saw an opportunity and chose deliberately to capitalize on pain? Maybe both. But maybe the better question isn't who was she, but what allowed her to exist for so long without being stopped. But in true crime, the real horror often lies not just in the killer, but in everything that let them happen. But the accomplices, the ones who made it easy by looking away, they're harder to name. Dagmar died quietly, but the law she inspired remained. The children she took never grew up, but their absence changed a nation. And their mothers, the ones who walked away believing in a better future, never got answers. Only silence. So now we ask, was she born a killer, or did a broken world shape her into one? That's not for history to decide. It's for us. Now, let's move on to the next case. In Schenectady, a small town in upstate New York, there once lived a quiet woman in a white-painted house, just a few blocks from the fire station. Her name was Mary Beth Tinning. She was born there, raised there, got married, became a mother, and lost 9 children over the span of 14 years. No formal investigation was ever opened during that entire time. Medical records listed different causes: pneumonia, sudden infant death, congenital heart issues. The community sighed, then looked away. As if a tragedy repeated often enough could become just another part of life. When the last child passed away, an anonymous phone call came through in the middle of the night, and that's when things began to shift. I've read many case files on female killers. Some made headlines for their brutality. Others faded from public memory, surviving only in archived records and academic studies in criminal psychology. Mary Beth didn't fall into either extreme. She sat in the middle, not dramatic enough to shock, but strange enough to unsettle anyone who read closely. I sat among stacks of yellowing paper, reading and rereading the same sequence of events, the same repeated pattern. The mother brought the child to the hospital. The child was unresponsive. No signs of injury. No witnesses. By the 4th time, I started to wonder, is it possible for a mother to witness the passing of 9 children and for no one to ask why? When I first read the opening lines of the file, everything still felt quiet. The Tinning family wasn't the kind of family that drew attention. They lived in Schenectady, a small industrial city in upstate New York. Not far from New York City, but far enough that life wasn't sheenered by in the big events of the world. In the 1970s, this place felt almost frozen while the rest of the world kept changing. In a black and white photo from 1975, I saw Mary Beth in a round collar blouse, standing next to her husband and their 2 children. All 3 were smiling. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Joseph Tinning worked for General Electric, a steady job with a modest income. Mary Beth stayed home, occasionally taking on temporary work, but mainly handled the household. They had a car, a house, no debt, no signs of conflict. A typical working-class American family, the kind who don't make the news and don't raise suspicion. But it was that very normalcy that made me cautious. Some cases don't show their darkness through blood or violence. It hides beneath routine, where people reassure themselves it was probably just an accident. I reviewed the file from Ellis Hospital. On January 3rd, 1972, Mary Beth's first daughter, Jennifer, was rushed to the ER. She passed away within hours from what was labeled acute meningitis, a natural death, no autopsy, no investigation. 3 months later, her 2-year-old son, Joseph Jr., died at home. Cause of death, unexplained respiratory failure, no further medical review. I made a note, 2 consecutive cases. No investigation, no red flags. No one thought anything was wrong. A retired doctor who had worked at the hospital back then told me over the phone, "We trusted the mother. When she stayed calm and didn't seem panicked, we had no clear reason to be concerned." That sentence stayed with me. Even in modern times, society still holds an unspoken belief. Women, especially mothers, are inherently trustworthy. When a mother loses a child, we think of her pain. We don't stop to ask if there might be another truth. I wasn't forming a theory. But I began to understand why things kept happening without anyone stepping in. It wasn't about someone hiding things well. It was because Everyone trusted the mold, that if she looked normal, she probably wasn't capable of doing anything abnormal. I started reading more closely after the fourth death. It felt like stepping over a threshold I hadn't noticed at first. No longer a series of separate losses, but a repeating pattern with an unsettling rhythm. A child passed, a funeral followed, and not long after, a new child was born. Mary Beth once told an investigator, "I just hoped this time I could keep the baby a little longer." I read that line over and over. What came to mind wasn't suspicion, but a kind of exhaustion, like watching someone harm themselves while you stand by, powerless to intervene. Doctors, nurses, even neighbors said she didn't seem like someone who would do anything wrong. A thin woman with brown hair, sunken eyes, always looking down. No outbursts. No anger. No blame. I began to wonder, if a mother loses 4 children in just a few years but doesn't show grief, what does that mean? Resilience? Or trauma frozen into silence? In the archives of the medical examiner's office, I found a note from Dr. Thomas Oram. There was something in her eyes, not empty, but disconnected, as if she had learned to respond just enough so no one would ask more questions. I thought about other mothers, those who had lost children. Some cried until their voices gave out. Some couldn't enter the nursery for months. Some joined support groups. Mary Beth was different. After the 6th child died, she volunteered at the local ambulance squad. Many called it a brave act. I wasn't so sure. Maybe it was her way of continuing to appear as a devoted mother, someone who was still needed. A criminal psychology expert analyzed Mary Beth's case through the lens of Munchausen by proxy. She suggested that her behavior might have stemmed from a deep need for attention, for sympathy, and from a fear of abandonment rooted in early childhood. I underlined one line in that report. In some cases involving female serial killers, especially those who operate within family environments, tragedy doesn't stem from hatred, but from the overwhelming pressure of failing to hold on to the role of a mother. That sentence made me pause for a long time. In a society where women are expected to give life, to nurture, to protect, what happens when that very role becomes a trap? Maybe unhealed pain turns into a loop, pulling a mother further from herself than she ever meant to go. The more I read, the more I realize this wasn't just a true crime case. It was a tragedy made visible, where love and destruction wore the same face. I don't know the exact moment when doubt began to creep into the files. Maybe it was after the 7th child. Maybe it was when the doctors who once offered condolences started leaving notes instead. But there was a clear breaking point, not in the deaths themselves, but in how the adults around Mary Beth began to see her differently. I found a quiet note in the report from Ellis Hospital, written after the final admission. The mother showed no visible emotional response, did not ask the doctor any questions, did not move when the child became unresponsive. It wasn't the wording that chilled me. It was how often that same observation appeared in other records. The doctors didn't voice their unease, but they began to leave a trail, as if saving evidence for someone down the line. One neighbor's statement, quoted in the official investigation, read, "She had lost so much. I didn't want to doubt her, but something didn't feel right." Not an accusation, not pure sympathy either, just a sentence caught in between, haunted by hesitation. And for me, that hesitation was the first true sign that society had started to wake from a collective illusion. That quote captured something essential about that era, and maybe even now. When a woman steps into the role of a mother, her grief is assumed to be sacred, and anyone who questions her has to wrestle with their own conscience first. Mary Beth never let go of that role. She clung to it with suffocating precision. Every time she appeared in public, she embodied the expected image, Neatly tied hair, soft voice, hollow eyes. No one looked at her and imagined a female serial killer. That's why no one around her looked for social causes. No one screened for psychological disorders. They searched for genetic mutations. They searched for inherited diseases. They explained the deaths with medical terminology. And, as one expert in criminal psychology later wrote, that collective decision created a dangerous blind spot. There was press coverage at the time, but only in small local columns with titles like "Tragedy Continues at the Tinning Home." I read every article, and I couldn't help but wonder, if the grieving parent had been a man, would the media have stayed so quiet? I think about today. We still see cases emerging from seemingly perfect families. And when the truth breaks through, people always say the same thing. I didn't think she was capable of that. But trust, without verification, can become a dangerous weapon. Suspicion doesn't make society cruel. In some cases, it is an ethical reflex, one that, when shut down by gender bias, can lead to repeated loss. A cycle of silence, echoing like ritual. I don't believe Mary Beth walked into the police station out of remorse. I believe she did it because she still thought she could control the narrative. The first written confession was chilling in its simplicity. She said, "I did everything I could to make the crying stop. I don't know why. I just couldn't stand the sound." There was no pleading, no sign of mental breakdown. An investigator noted in his report, she didn't cry. Her voice was calm, almost cold. I read those lines close to midnight in a room filled only with the hum of a fan. And what haunted me wasn't what she had done to her children, but the fact that she could describe it as if she were talking about last night's dinner. Investigator William Barnes, the man who took her statement, was interviewed years later. He said, "I didn't see regret. The only thing she seemed to feel was exhaustion." I paused there for a long time. Exhaustion? Could there be a kind of exhaustion so deep that someone no longer feels the small lives around them, as if trying to silence a sound that has dragged on for a lifetime? If so, then this was no longer just personal wrongdoing. It was the collapse of a community, where no one asked questions, no one intervened, no one stepped in. After her confession was made public, I went back to the old articles that had once written about Mary Beth with sympathy. Those stories were gone. They had been replaced by sensational headlines. Mother accused in deaths of 9 children. Monster in a gentle disguise. I understood why the media did it, but I also saw something else. The anger society felt wasn't only directed at Mary Beth. It was aimed at themselves, for not seeing it sooner, for letting trust cloud judgment. At a press conference, a local resident broke down in tears and said, "We held funerals for those children. We prayed, we hugged Mary Beth. We didn't know." No one wants to believe that their kindness was used to shield a female serial killer, but it was. And as I write this, what haunts me isn't the crime itself. It's the silence. A silence that lasted 14 years, wrapped in affection, rituals, and gender expectations. A silence that killed. The trial didn't last long. There were no heated arguments, no dramatic objections like in the movies. Just silence, as if everyone had grown too exhausted to feel anger one more time. Mary Beth was charged with causing the tragic end of her youngest child, Tammy Lynn, a baby just 3 months old. She wasn't prosecuted for the 8 previous deaths, even though the same patterns repeated across every death report, even though all of them passed under unclear circumstances, even though everyone silently sensed something was wrong. The law still demanded specific evidence. I used to think that verdict was a paradox, as if people were deliberately turning away from the truth. Even after 9 consecutive losses, only one case was brought to trial. and only one sentence was delivered. The other 8 names sank into paperwork, never spoken again. But then I understood. Justice doesn't always run parallel to intuition. It follows procedures, clauses, and the limits of language and proof. And within those limits, so much loss is never called by its rightful name. A criminal psychology expert once said on live television, "This is a classic case of a female offender manipulating public emotion. They don't need to run because their victims are no longer here to speak." That line brought me back to one detail in the file. There wasn't a single official witness who stood against Mary Beth. No neighbors, no doctors, no relatives, only a series of recorded losses and a confession whispered like a breath. I followed the trial's coverage through newspaper archives. Some were angry, some confused, but most people stayed silent. No one stood up to publicly argue her guilt, as if everyone was simply tired, or as if society had become too used to women being the ones who endure and too stunned when the woman turned out to be the cause of suffering. A former classmate of Mary Beth, interviewed outside the courtroom, said, "I don't understand what happened. She used to be a good person." I've thought about that sentence many times, because it's not just an excuse. It's proof of a collective moral blind spot, where good intentions can be easily manipulated if they come from someone who knows how to stay quiet, smile, and show up just in time to receive sympathy. And then I think about the children. None of them had a voice. None were truly heard. Even in court, their names were reduced to cold phrases like unidentified victim or death by unknown cause. 9 children. 9 chances for society to intervene, and didn't. I used to think justice meant punishing the guilty. Now I understand. Sometimes justice is simply when people stop pretending they didn't see. I closed the case file just as the first light crept through the window. Outside, the city was still, as if the world hadn't changed after 9 silent deaths. Mary Beth Tinning is still serving a life sentence at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. She has filed for parole several times. But to this day, no one truly knows what she thinks, or ever thought, about everything that happened. Some have called her a monster. Others say it was a disorder. And then there are people like me, who simply read through each page in silence, trying to understand, how could a mother in the heart of a quiet community live with such crimes for so many years without anyone stopping to ask? None of the 9 children ever had the chance to tell their story. And I'm not sure anything I write can change that. But if there's one thing that remains after everything, it isn't anger. It's a reminder. If you ever feel something isn't right, don't ignore it. Ask. Step in. Sometimes your awareness might be what saves a life. And if this story makes you pause, share it, because somewhere out there may still be cries going unheard in a world too busy to listen. You've just joined me in revisiting 5 stories, 5 glimpses into a deep, dark corner that exists within each of us. Every case raises questions worth reflecting on. Is crime the result of a mind already corrupted or of a life pushed to the very edge? Perhaps no one can ever say with certainty what the real answer is. But at the very least, by taking the time to understand these cases, we've moved one step closer to awareness, instead of simply reacting with fear or judgment. In the next episodes, I'll continue to share more case files, along with psychological perspectives on crime from different angles. If you'd like to